What's going on, guys? Welcome to In the Zone. I'm your host, Garrison Roy, and today we're going to have a little dynamic duo interview today. But for those of you who are new, we do have those fooling conversations with other experts, athletes, and coaches. And we also have rants where I would just go on, discuss hot topics, or maybe call out some BS in the industry and vent. And then we also have deep dive educational explorations going into small intricacies of the game, whether that's skill acquisition zone or maybe even just some of the research zone or anything training wise in those different types of zones that help you guys become better athletes and better coaches. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and get right into this one because I think this is going to be very action packed. But we're going to have Yuji, Suzuki, and Tanner Pruett on. And if you guys have not heard of them before, Yuji was on episode 147 and Tanner was on episode 136. And I think a previous one right before that for part one as well on 134. So, guys, what's going on? Love to have you on.
Hey man, thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Yes,
fun
sir.
to fun to be back on.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I've kind of seen your guys' journey together from the outside, seeing some things that you guys have posted and interacted with on social media, but I know there's probably a lot more that needs to be unpacked here, as far as how you guys have met, interacted, and then how you guys are really kind of cultivating a new wave of how guys return to sport or how they are going about training, really, to be honest.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, Yuji, do you want to take it, or do you want me to kind of start off with how I guess I kind of heard about you, or I guess how we got started?
Yeah. You can go ahead and tell our story, tell your side of the story, I guess. Because I think we started working together last August, July, maybe,
I think it
or
was
even before that.
honestly, I think it was before that. I want to say it was like almost like a year ago, like late
Yeah,
April, early
yeah, I guess
May, I
so.
think, when we first contacted each other about getting started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why don't you just kind of walk us through with like what made you want to reach out to me in the first place? What were the obstacles that you were kind of encountering?
Hmm.
Because it has been quite a while, and at this point, you're way past, an intense return to pitching slash rehab. Part of it,
Hmm.
we're kind of getting a lot more into performance as of late. So, um, I might need some reminder, honestly, but talk us through some of the things that you were feeling, maybe.
Yeah, so I think it was in March, I think, when I realized, like, okay, I need to do something. We had, I played in that Charlotte Adult League. We played in like a preseason tournament. And I just remember everything, like my arm just kind of hurt way more than normal. Um, and I didn't reach out to anybody. I just kind of tried it on my own, just with things, and felt good to start. But then after, I think, first or second week of the regular season, I'm like, I need to shut it down. Like, I need to figure something out. And I struggled with trying to find somebody that could help me, but wasn't super traditional old school PT, because that just really wasn't working. It worked for a short period of time, like years before, but using those same ideas and same exercises just wasn't getting me just to be pain free, simply just to play catch.
Mhm.
And I still really enjoy throwing a baseball because it's fun, and it kind of sucks when the lightest thing you can do hurts. Um, so I was talking with Rich White to see if he knew anybody, because he was doing all my S&C stuff with me, because I hate programming for myself. When I'm programming for a bunch of other athletes, I'll cut corners and do things like that. But if somebody else is doing it for me, I tend to follow. And he was like, hey, you should reach out to Yuji. I know he's like, I know he is in the TMA course. He's got some really good ideas and he seems really smart. Just like reach out to him and see what you guys can work out together, if you guys are a good fit or not. So I think Yuji had actually messaged me on Instagram like months before that, because it's something about like Crown, I think, because you were like, oh, what
Oh
year
yeah.
were you there? This was like, even I think, a year before that when you found me, because Crown had won the UMAC tournament for like the first time ever. And you're like, oh, we just missed each other, something like that. And so I kind of knew who he was. I just didn't know really anything about him other than he played at Concordia. Like that was it. So reached out to Yuji and we set up a phone call. And then from there, it was like, oh, wow, this is way different. It simplified the complex problems that PT tends to over complicate, if that makes any sense. Like I think on our initial phone call, Yuji, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong if you remember it, but I said something along the lines of, I can pick up a 2 pound plyo, throw it as hard as I can without a warm up, and I'm fine. But as soon as I start going down in weight closer to a baseball, I said my bicep just flares up. And Yuji, you said, so it sounds like the problem that your arm is having trouble solving is high speeds. And then from that, like that one line, I was like, yeah, that makes so much sense, but I've never thought of it that way. Like for me, I think of as a skill coach, problem solving is always within context. But then to hear like, oh, that's the general problem my arm is trying to solve, and it can't do that. So then it was just trying to find other things that expose my arm to high speeds or high velocities without actually throwing. And that's kind of where we started. I
No, I
mean, do you
love
have
it.
anything to add to that, Yuji?
Yeah, I mean, things are coming back to me now. One of the things that I have to do is define the gap between what the person can tolerate and what they can't tolerate, and figure out like what's in between, right? To gradually take steps towards being able to tolerate the other thing, which usually is the thing that they want to get back to. But you are somebody who already came in with an entry point that you knew of from your experience. So that made it a little bit um, easier to get started at least. And it was like already a throwing thing instead of like, oh, I can't barely pick up a ball, but I can bench. Then that gap is a little bit more um, complicated than like, okay, you are already able to throw. We just have to figure out what's the difference between a heavy ball and a faster pitching velocity from the mound. So as soon as we had that hypothesis, like I wasn't going to say like that was definitely the thing. That was where my mind went to. We get to test that out. And we had a situation where, we started testing that out and it went really well, right?
Yeah,
We didn't
it
encounter
definitely,
like a
yeah.
massive problem right away. So again, relatively um smooth in terms of like, all right, we have a hypothesis of where we can start,
Mm-hmm.
um, and we can kind of go from there. And in other cases, sometimes I'm making a lot more changes of like, okay, we thought that was going to work. This is garbage. So we got to kind of pivot gear. And I think it's that ability to change directions and not be completely sold on like the first idea that we had. That's dynamical systems, right? Like it's not
Mm.
that, we've figured, I said, okay, that's the root cause. Now we're going to be working on that for 6 months, even if there wasn't any progress. So I think that was something that went really well for us working together, incorporating, you know, things that were a little bit more high velocity. And at the same time, if I remember correctly, you had a little bit of like a positional discomfort or pain where, the bicep would be fine at 90 degrees or something, but at a more extended 130 degrees plus, that's when you were having a little bit more of a difficulty with it. So we tackle those with some isometrics because those are great exercises to target like specific positions. And you were able to kind of push and gradually build up kind of intensity and output on those exercises pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we had to like take you out of throwing much at all throughout this entire process. Maybe
No,
early on you were like gradually going back in, but
yeah, because I think what happened was I threw in like the second game of that season. I was like, okay, I have to like I need to take a week off. This just hurts too much. And then I reached out to you, and it was like a basically a 4 week kind of return to throw program, if you want to call it that. But I kind of want to touch on some of the exercises you actually gave me. Like I remember, I think after the first couple of weeks of doing it, I actually like I felt stress from the workouts or from the exercises that kind of irritated the problem I had, which I think you had said that's kind of what we're looking for. We're looking to irritate it, find out where it is, and then train it. Because all the traditional PT stuff I'd done in the past, it was like it wasn't stressful. Like it
Yeah.
didn't really feel like I was getting much of an adaptation. I was moving, and I think movement is never bad, but I think not adding stress or not adding load or intensity or volume to it. I think like when we started doing that, I think it was like the underhand tosses. You're like, all right, max effort underhand tosses 2 pound plyo into the wall. And it was like, oh, I'm feeling that same bicep discomfort just at a much lower scale. And it was like, okay, cool. We're going to keep doing those because it is agitating it just enough to possibly create an adaptation. I might be messing up some words there, but is that pretty much like your thought on that?
Yeah. I think one of the things that stood out to me when we had our initial conversation was that you were going through this boom and bust cycle of like, all right, you would pitch and then you would have to take a couple of weeks off,
Mm-hmm.
right? 3, 4 weeks off, and you try again and it happens again,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that to me felt like, okay, there is definitely opportunities in terms of improving capacity so that when you do go back, it's not like you had just been resting, you actually built up your tolerance. And that's a pretty common story
Mm-hmm.
where resting like works for many people in many pain situations. But if you're finding out that the rest going back into the activity again is, resulting in the same issue, then rest isn't doing it anymore. It's not just like, oh, it was irritated, I got to calm things down and then just I can go back to it. It was more of like, okay, it seems to be that for whatever reason, this throwing activity, pitching activity is just a little too much for your most painful area. Now we got to do some work in between those times to let's build it up and see what happens. Right. Not that you were like weak or immobile or like you were lacking in some capacity, but it was just a leverage. Like if you address this, um, then what's likely going to happen is that you'll be able to tolerate it a little bit better. So that led me to go towards almost like reframing pain a little bit, where we know that we don't have to necessarily avoid every amount of pain,
Mhm.
right? So we talked about categorizing pain into 4 levels: no pain, tolerable amounts of pain, edge of tolerance, and suffering, which helped with our communication and conversation and really get detailed understanding of where exactly your tolerance line is so that we can push towards it and go towards adaptation without going to the suffering type of pain and just like making it angry, because that's not productive at all. It's this fine balance between pushing it but not pushing it too much, like poking the bear but you don't want to kick it while it's sleeping, like you don't want to be like throwing a party in its den.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I think after that conversation too is like I no longer fear pain or discomfort with certain things. It's like, oh, if we can categorize it and if I can just live at, I think it was like tolerable and just keep stacking up those days and building a tolerance there, it was like, oh, okay, I don't have to be afraid that something's going to break. Like the human body isn't that fragile. So it was like kind of relieving, like, okay, if I get to a tolerable amount, like that's okay. Like pain
Yeah.
is part of life. It's going to happen. I think that was also a huge thing that I think a lot of athletes kind of struggle with is as soon as there's pain, they're done. And it's like, are you? So
Oh, absolutely. And that's like, honestly, it sounds so simple, but it's very revolutionary because people do nothing but avoid it, right? Or like in that traditional sense, they're like, hey, shut down. You're not going to irritate it. You're not going to do anything to, you know, maybe even have some of those feelings that you felt, right? They're trying to avoid things versus almost running towards that. But I love how you guys broke that down, or how Yuji said you're breaking it down into those 4 different levels. So you're like, hey, this is tolerable. I can still kind of flirt with this in a way to make sure that it's like, hey, like we're building up tolerance and attacking that versus taking a more passive approach and just be like, hey, we'll rest and, pop a couple ibuprofen and then roll back out there and see what happens. But I know there's a lot of those guys out here listening, maybe coaches listening, who've had players that are kind of continuing to go through that cycle. And you can take that same principle for the bicep, and correct me if I'm wrong, EGB, you can kind of apply it anywhere, obviously with some guidance. Like you don't want to do that on your own, like Tanner tried to do. But it's something that I think is definitely eye-opening for a lot of people. And once they realize that and they're like, oh, hey, I don't have to just take time off and then try again, but with the exact same, or maybe even sometimes could be worse if they're not addressing the problem.
Yeah. And to just because the focus of this conversation is more the psychological dynamics perspective, I almost think about it as like educating intention and attention around the constraint of pain, right? So when pain shows up, that constrains our behaviors and movement options. And the way I can potentially support somebody in that situation is to, again, help reframe and talk about pain a little bit so that you came out with a different intention of like, oh, pain, I got to stop. Now you get to hold an intention to like, okay, I'm playing around with it. And because of that shift in intention, now your attention changes into like, all right, what am I feeling with this exercise? What am I feeling with this exercise? Like, what am I noticing here? So you get to kind of change the experience around pain a little bit by having conversation, by going through some movements that are, different and feel safe, but still addresses, kind of those similar situations. So I think that's kind of how I think about it, is like pain is a constraint, but where we get stuck as humans is that, all right, we get stuck in this attractor state of doing the same thing when we encounter pain all the time. And sometimes that's okay, but when there is an obstacle where you're getting stuck in that situation, a little bit of guidance can just like shift intention and attention around pain to then invite a different behavior. So it's less of like a sport movement affordance conversation. It's a little bit more zoomed out in terms of like human behavior, I guess. But that's kind of how I think about it. I don't always talk about this with like people because they don't care. It doesn't matter. And I've never talked about this to you, Tanner, because it doesn't matter ultimately to change what you're doing. But you definitely at that time, a change was, necessary because you were kind of stuck in a cycle.
Yeah, getting out of that rut. Well, and even what you were saying there, taking that zoomed out view, like I've been getting this question rather frequently, and I'm sure Tanner might be getting this from other people as well, is like, hey, what do you think is the reason for all of these arm injuries and stuff at higher levels and things like that? And I'm just like, hey, you know what? That sounds like a doctoral dissertation where we can go down and break it all into multiple different things and what can contribute to it. Because it's never just one thing. It's never just the pitch count or the way guys train, or, some people are saying like, oh, it's the nutrition, right? Like it's all those things and then some, right?
100%. Yeah. And so we were doing some direct work to your problem spot, which was like bicep and some of those underhand stuff. It adds a, stretching component to it. So it was more of this, like you had some triggers in terms of velocity of the movement, right? Which, makes it a different like force profile, obviously. Position situation. So we were doing a lot of ISOs in, open pec position, kind of that shoulder way back, bicep in certain angles. So those were, I would say, more problem focused work that we did. But we also incorporated a lot of like rep without rep exploration type of activities that were kind of tackling areas adjacent to the shoulder slash bicep, right? So do you want to kind of talk about a couple of those ones that you've really liked? I don't know if you remember. I actually have your program pulled up here from way back then.
Yeah, I think my favorite exercise to start was pickups, holding the kettlebell overhead and then setting a lacrosse ball or a baseball down and then picking it back up in different spots. Like it was a lot of lateral flexion in the spine, a lot of getting the lower half to move a little bit differently, because an added constraint was I couldn't move my feet. They could pivot, but I couldn't take a step back or to the side to get or set the ball down and make it easier. So I think that was my favorite because it was a full body movement, but also it was like, based on things I've learned, like, yeah, if you want healthy shoulders, your spine has to be able to move somewhat. So like getting that to move a little bit more, I don't know, it just felt good. I felt really great afterwards. And I think I added it in on days that Yuji didn't give it to me because it was low stress, not heavy load, but it got me moving and it had my whole body basically feeling good. And then recently I like the 4 zones, 3 limbs, and then the I think you call it weird shapes with a PVC pipe on the mound, like touching each side to different spots. Like again, full body, but also like yes, shoulder is getting worked, forearms are getting worked a little bit with the 4 zones or 4 limbs, 3 zones. Just I don't know, it just felt like a true holistic approach, if you want to call it that way, when we started adding those.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Garrison.
Oh, I was gonna just comment those 4 limbs, 3 zones kind of reminded me a lot of a Ido Portal exercise I saw probably about 4 or 5 years ago, where he was just like, hey, like you want to be in that bear crawl position almost. Whatever limb is furthest away is the one that you want to take it to the wall. But now that you're putting it in different zones, almost like a four square, gamifying it a little bit more is really cool. And then seeing that from the
Yeah.
outside perspective. So if you for the reaches, right, like you're holding that kettlebell up overhead. I remember seeing these like on your feed, but like it actually makes total sense, right? Because like we're trying to get the scap to move, you know, and try to perform like a Y, T, or an I, so to speak, right? But like that's just very pre-scripted movements versus like what you were probably trying to go for. And correct me if I'm wrong, Yuji, but you were just trying to see, hey, how can we get that scap to stay upwardly rotated and still be able to problem solve? And that's just kind of how some of the initial thoughts that I saw through there, because you're
Yeah.
just basically giving it a bunch of different uh, avenues to learn how to move and be stable and be strong in, right?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think the thing is, like, I'm not trying to reinvent exercises. Like, if you look at these exercises, you're right. Like, the 4 zones or 3 zones, 4 limbs, that's a bear crawl, right? The kettlebell pickups, that's just kettlebell windmill, right? So it's almost like I understand that these exercises are beneficial, like in terms of directing load to, all right, like, all right, closed kinetic for bear crawl, like it's closed kinetic chain, your hands are on the ground, and you have to like keep your body up off the ground. So you're like kind of pushing into the floor,
Sure.
meaning like your shoulder, your scap, those are working, right? Regardless of having a perfect form or not. Now, with the ecological perspective, I get to just turn that into a rep without rep situation. I could have told you to just say, all right, bear crawl, but do it in different ways. But essentially, by adding this task constraint, now I'm almost like encouraging you to explore different positions, extreme positions that you definitely wouldn't get into if you were just going from point A to point B. Same thing with like the pickup situation. Basically, you're trying to hold weight overhead. Now, all right, your scap is challenged to stay upright, upwardly rotated, and just kind of in that shoulder flex position. But almost like you're twisting the bottom of the jar instead of top of the jar. It's not twisting necessarily, but you're moving the body underneath. So your scap is going to be having to be in different positions in relationship to the body. right? So again, these are just tasks that, we were playing around with to encourage different movements, encourage variability in your movement solutions. And yes, it's not related to pitching per se, but it still challenges those, complex shoulder complex in a different way. Now, we have us working together, we have a constraint of remoteness. So I'm not there with you. And you have to work out pretty much all by yourself all the time. Right. So those are key constraints that we've had to kind of navigate in terms of our coach athlete dynamic, because you being here with me or me being in your environment and guiding you through these movements, that would completely be different. But we were working around the constraints that we were kind of given. It's kind of the same thing with now that we're in the performance stage. Yes, are there things that we wish we could implement, but we also have to be pragmatic and like actually, make the best of what we have. That doesn't mean that we have to be complacent. We're gonna, we keep pushing towards more representative ideal practice, maybe. But there are moments where we can't. So I think it's this understanding of like, all right, we have a potential ideal in mind and where we want to go in mind, but we're going to make the best of what we got. So that's kind of the constraint of like remote work that we do, I guess,
Yeah,
which is
and I
kind of a different
almost,
topic, but sorry.
but I almost think that being remote for the general movement stuff is actually kind of better than being in person, because like I did this when I was a remote coach, where I had like an idea of how exactly I would want it to go, but then the athlete would interpret it differently, and it would actually end up being better than what I expected. So it's almost like there's more freedom for the athlete to uh, take ownership or problem solve on their own. Now, are there things where it would be nice to have somebody in person? Yes, 100%. But I think the majority of the general movement stuff, it's like, hey, like you're on your own. You actually have to have some feel here, and you actually have to have some awareness of what's going on with what we're doing, instead of the athlete wanting somebody to hold their hand and take them through it. Does that make sense?
It shows kind of your communication skills too, I think, a little bit, right? It's like how clearly can you define what you want to have happen, or maybe you leave it more open-ended for interpretation to see how they even respond or move. Kind of like what you were saying earlier, Yuji, of like, hey, yeah, show me how many different ways you could move in a bear crawl, or hey, if you want a more specific adaptation, right, or a specific movement pattern to arise, then you got to be a little bit more specific, or maybe change the task or change the environment that you're in to be able to get that to happen. It makes total sense.
Yeah. No, I love that because like communication is definitely one of the things that I just prioritize in terms of like improving. Um, and it's kind of funny because like there are some instructions that like make sense to me and it just doesn't make sense to my athletes. And sometimes videos help, but ultimately, like I'm not, because I see myself not as a prescriber, like I'm not trying to like guide them or push them to like a perfect movement. I'm trying to embody that, like, hey, this is messy, man. It's like as much as I try to explain things as best I can, I try to film, but I'm changing the exercise for tomorrow and I don't have time to film. And again, I'm fostering and I'm explaining it, setting expectation right away too, where like this process is going to be messy. Like if you're expecting, like a perfectly manicured program that's, got every instructions and it forces you into movement, that's not what this is about. This is a lot more of exploration. We're going to encounter some pain and you're going to have some irritations here and there, but it's okay. It's part of the process and I'm going to guide you through that. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be like complacent and like, oh, I'm just going to be a lazy coach. It's more of this expectation that like mistakes happen, right? messiness happen, unexpected things happen. And the way I respond to those things matter, like it changes the culture of the interaction as well. Like if I'm coming in like, oh, that movement, no, 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 don't do that. Oh, you have pain, no, 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 stop. Then it doesn't matter what I say in other occasion of like pain is okay, but I turn around and I'm telling them, okay, there was a pain, you got to stop, you got to move like this. Then that's a conflicting message between my actions and my words, right? So I think that's where it really, um, the marriage between ecological dynamics and contemporary pain knowledge about pain is almost complementary, because it allows me to embody both of those messages at the same time and not be in conflict. If anything, it strengthens my underlying philosophy or understanding of human experience, I guess.
Wow. Yeah. No, yeah, that's a great way to put it. Because I mean, we've all, and I'm totally guilty of this myself, and I'm sure Tanner even alluded to this too, but like you want things to look a certain way, so then you become almost the dictator of the movement problem or the movement solution that they would come up with. And it gets very rigid, and you can even see it on how guys move or across all sports. Really, it's not just baseball, but like you can see how over cueing or just allowing them to try to think that they need to move a certain way makes them move almost really robotic and freezes their freedom, lack of better terms and puns there, right? But you're freezing the degrees of freedom to have them be able to move freely. And sometimes it may not look as aesthetically pleasing as what might work best for them. And some of the best athletes, even some of the best pitchers, and if you want to stick to the game of baseball, right, like they move different. Not everybody moves the same, and you can't try to put that on every single person, right? There's certain principles that work, but if you want everybody to be coming out looking like they have a 3/4 arm slot with a quarter squat hinge, and you finish in the fielder's position, just very extremes. But that's it's very hard to allow high performance to emerge from that. So
Yeah, it's maybe it's helpful for us to kind of know where we don't want to go more than where we want them to go, right? So it's almost like, again, that's kind of the constraints led approach of like, we are pretty confident about where we don't want them to go. For in the case of pain, we don't want you going into the suffering type of pain,
yeah.
right? To me, that's more helpful because we put fence around those potential triggers, right? Potential injurious movements. And we get to actually explore on this whole other side of the playing field. Whereas when we have we have like a perfect mechanics or exactly where we want to go in mind, then the path gets just narrowed, right? So
Mhm.
there's no room for exploration. Um, and that acceptable level of uncertainty varies between situations as well. Like if you are wanting to pitch in a championship game Sunday and we have 5 days to just calm this down, we can't be just willy-nilly playing around with a bunch of different things. There's going to be a little bit tighter constraints, control that we want to have, because like the cost is too high.
Mhm.
And that's why this happens at different levels. Like, okay, in the bicep area for you, we had less wiggle room to play around with because we didn't want to flare things up too much. But in the spine, in the shoulder, in the scap, we had a lot more room to accept variability. We had a lot more to explore different movement options, different force profiles. So I think that's kind of the transcending message of like, all right, where do we not want to go? And where is the room for variability or exploration or authentic and creative movements? Um, does that make sense?
That makes total sense. It's almost like you're shutting off. I think of it as like a circuit board, be like, hey, we don't want these wires to work. We want to unplug that one and let these other ones do all the work in a way. It sounds kind of oversimplified, but or maybe you think of it as like, hey, there's multiple doors in front of you. We're going to lock this door, make sure that you don't go down that suffering pain, but you have a bunch of other options here that you can go down.
Yeah. No, I
Tanner,
like those analogies.
oh yeah. Tanner, what was that process for you? Like learning how to be comfortable with pain, right? Like how did you kind of get past that, or almost kind of be like, okay, hey, this is okay to kind of be here now? And also kind of maybe there's an instance where you're like, hey, this is suffering and we got to find our way back.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know because a lot of it I just kind of relied on Yuji to start, just to like, okay, this is what you want me to do. I've tried all these other things. It obviously didn't work.
Yeah, so you're
And
bought
so it
in at
was,
the beginning.
yeah, so it was like, okay, this is a completely different, I don't want to say a completely different approach, but a completely different way of executing
Yeah.
of where we're trying to get to where I was just like, this just makes sense. Like Yuji explained it, like the 4 levels of pain. He talks about like no pain, tolerable, edge of suffering, and then suffering. But he labeled it as 1, 2, 3, 4. Like it was like the first couple of weeks we started, we're like, hey, let's just stick to 1s and 2s. But as soon as you get to a 3, like let's just shut it down for the day. And I think what I used to do before that was like I would always get to a 3 because in my mind, if I can just keep stacking up 3s, then we'll build some tolerance. But when he said no, we want 2s, it's like we wanted just enough to irritate it, but not enough to obliterate it in a sense. So it
Mhm.
was like, okay, like when you work out, you don't want to be dead sore 5 days a week,
Right.
right? You want enough of a stimulus, but like the minimal effective dose, I think,
Mhm.
is. And like I started thinking about that idea when Yuji and I started working together. It's like, okay, yeah, if 2 is the minimum effective dose, or whatever it's called, let's just stack up those. And then there would be days where he's like, hey, let's see how far we can push it until we get to a 3. So instead of just like a clear 2 where we're comfortable, like a tolerable pain, like how high of an intensity can you get to and still be in a 2? And I was like, oh, so that's how we're going to push it, not necessarily velocity wise, but like pain level wise. Like, what does it look like to get to a 3 now after a couple weeks of stacking up 2s? Like, what does that look like? And then we kind of be like, okay, so then now we know what the next step is, or what we can do for the next day of throwing, or okay, this is how we're going to change the workouts that he gave me. It was all kind of based on where do you get to when it becomes on that edge of suffering or a 3.
Yeah. If I could clarify one thing, the goal or target wasn't irritation. It was still adaptation, but it's like we're willing to accept irritation up to the level of 2. It's like subtle, nuanced difference, but I think that's a key difference. Like we're not challenging things just to irritate it. We still have adaptation in mind, and we're willing to accept irritation, pain, discomfort up to the level as long as you're feeling safe. And this is, also again, context dependent because we're not doing similar things when there's like fracture or like nerve things in play because those, structures respond differently, right? And so there's different levels of like, again, pain that we're able to accept in those processes. But I think the key thing is we walked up to that edge of suffering together almost, and we had conversations. So in my mind, I was trying to help you again develop a different relationship with your pain, right? So initially, when you were and athletes do this all the time, we have tendency to push through pain because we want to grind and hard work. Like we're just wired this way, right? Like generally, again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but then earlier in those stages, if I notice that somebody is more likely to push 2, 3, and like past 3, then early on, I might put a constraint a little bit earlier on of like, okay, let's just not go for 3 too often, right? And see how that goes. Knowing that we had a longer timeline. right? Now we get to kind of just have discussions about like, okay, like what about the pain felt dangerous to you? What, do you think, what do you think contributed to this being a 3 versus this being a 2? So we were always, again, having discussions around pain. Again, the same idea of like pain is a constraint, but there's more than one way to interact with that. And you have to learn. It's not just me telling you how to interact. And we kind of did that together, if anything. Does that kind of make sense? We were like, it's not like I told you that this is how it's going to work and you just did it. We were always, it's a learning process, right? And we were wayfinding to, that's a beautiful concept, but wayfinding our way through that pain environment.
I think it kind of relates a little bit, and Tanner, you can probably agree, to guys almost like when they warm up, there's the all or none guy, and then there's the guy who just like, okay, we're just gonna lightly, toss it. That can kind of reflect to how certain guys have a relationship with pain. They're just like, oh, I'm barely nudging. I'm gonna stay down here between these ones and twos and never go to a 3 or even try to push to like a 3.5 or whatever the number system would be for them at that point. But you kind of have to almost know the athlete, right? As Yuji's going through this, like you have to know, okay, hey, you're willing to push to this point. I can either push you more or I got to pull back the reins, or maybe it's just in these instances here where maybe we just need to explore this a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see people who are a little bit more avoidance based, where like they're not even willing to go into 2, right? They've never
Yeah.
thought about, hey, this actually feels safe if I'm really thinking about it. So those are like, you know, when I was playing, the messages about like if forearms sore tight, like you just shut it down, right? That was one of the messages that I've used to hear all the time. I don't know how it is now, but is that's a hard rule that doesn't allow room for context and nuance and understanding, because some tightness is just like normal, right? And if we're avoiding every single one of those situations, right, no matter the context and no matter like what the buildup to that was, right, like the story behind it, the dynamic interaction of causes that led to that point, then again we're like avoiding everything and we don't get to make adaptation necessarily, right? So I things kind of got jumbled there, but pushing through all the time or avoiding all the time, both of those situations can be problematic when it comes to pain. So
Mhm.
sometimes it's just navigating this and finding the balance between those things, and again learning your own experience around it, just reframing it if you're getting stuck.
Yeah. Well, and that's usually when people are searching for help, is whenever they are stuck in a rut, or they're constantly having the same pain, kind of like where Pruett was at, right? He was in that same cycle. Hey, I throw, I have pain, or I throw, rest, and back to that pain. You just continue to kind of go down this merry-go-round. It just never changes. You're just stuck on that versus, hey, let's go down and go on a walking trail and then experience these things a little bit differently. So I love it. I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, Tanner, you
Do you
got any
think
other? Oh, go ahead.
do you think it would be helpful for us to kind of talk about what things look like as you were getting back into pitching more of like the transition between pain and performance? Because we did a lot of like practice discussions as well, um, as you were, and even now, like as you were getting back into pitching and now kind of prepping early season for summer ball and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
that'd be really
definitely think that'd be
valuable
valuable.
because some people, that's where I think a lot of the whole of return to throw, return to sport, rather like full intent, getting back into it is what's missing, right? Like maybe there's different approaches to how you ramp up from pain or surgery to return, but what did that look like for you guys?
Yeah. Again, there were constraints in terms of you having hitters, catchers, right? There were limitations in terms of like how representative we can make things, right? And winter in Minnesota, like it just doesn't work, right? You
Nope.
can't just go outside and get, 9 guys together. But so we were always looking for opportunities to make things a little bit more representative, right? So instead of okay, we can't do the ideal, so we can't do anything. We were like, okay, what's one way we can make this a little bit more representative? One way we can inject slices of the game, and things like throwing off the mound, even when you were playing catch, or what else did we try? I mean, like dummy hitters, again, not ideal, but better than other things. Keeping count, making, adding pressure, changing what's in your sight, right? Some of these things are ways to kind of incorporate variability and kind of the ecological principles when your environment is limited in terms of what you can implement and having other humans. What else did I miss with those?
I think one of the big ones was like okay, as soon as you get on the mound and you start pitching, like here's your sequence. Like you're not going to throw 5 fastballs, 5 breaking balls, 5 changeups, and then repeat that. It was like fastball, slider, changeup, and it was just we would repeat those same 3 over and over. But it was like, how many times in a game are you going to throw 5 straight fastballs? Not really. So it was still having some kind of structure, but also adding, I don't necessarily want to say variability, but not throwing the same pitch 2 times in a row. It might have been the same sequence, but it's still a different pitch each time. I think that was big. And the other
Can I
one,
touch on that super quick?
yes, you can.
So that was, I think we went the complete random way once, right? And it just was too much. So it was more of
Yeah.
like you were doing this block practice kind of in a way where you were doing fastball, 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 slider, 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 slider. And then we decided that, hey, is that how you pitch? I'm like, okay, no. What if we went to just random and you went like what, 40% strikes or something? Like
Oh, it
just
was way less than that because
like
I
something sad.
we threw in every pitch was different, but we also were like said you're gonna have different throwing mechanics every pitch, whether it's different side of the rubber, hand overhead, no leg kick, pause like it was like every pitch was something
Like
different.
differential learning.
That's
And
like having
so
4 different steering wheels on a car.
yes. And I just remember like, yeah, I had fun, but like I could like it was spray and pray. Like I had no clue where it was going. And so that's when I was like, okay, like I like this. However, the failure rate is way too high to really get anything too meaningful. And I think that's where we went to, okay, let's just go with the pitches.
Yeah,
Maybe
we
you
went to
go
sequence after that.
like wind up or stretch, like mixing that in, or like a pause leg kick and no leg kick, but it was like not as extreme. Like we still had all of those elements, but it wasn't like throwing everything at the wall, even though that's kind of what that first session was like. I was hitting the wall more than I was hitting the zone. But it just like that one, I think it was like 50% strike rate. And it was like, okay, I can kind of feel, creating these degrees of freedom with this variability. And it was like, okay, here's like I actually got something out of it. And we just kind of built off of that. Um,
Yeah.
do you want to
Because
add
that's
anything to that?
when you were having to pitch to a 9 pocket, like not great, right?
Mhm.
So in that, with those constraints, what can we do? And we were being more intentional about like your command, I guess. So like strike percentage. So even in the 9 pocket, we had point system in terms of like, all right, we're gonna set up the 9 pocket at the middle of the home plate, So it's like, actual strike zone instead of like a catcher. And if you hit the edge and it goes out, still a strike, but those are great pitches that just like nicks the corner. Then those are higher points. If it hits the frame and goes in, that's a different level of points. And if it just goes in, again, lowest number of points. So there was an intention around still working on command, but adding variability on the starting end of that.
Yeah, we did that one, and I think there was, so I still was able to get live ABs like once a week. Like we were able to get hitters in once a week. So I guess these are more of the sessions like leading up to that. But there were a couple weeks where like we were doing all this variability stuff, and then I would get to live, and it was just like walk, hit batter, like there's just out of 6 ABs, and only I got 1 or 2 outs. So it was like, okay, something's got to change here. And it was really interesting. Yuji was like, what if you just barely miss the 9 pocket on each throw? Like you're throwing balls, but there's still a target that you're trying to, I can't remember how you explained it, but like living on the edge, but purposely missing. Kind of like knowing what it feels like to do it wrong. I can't remember what words you used exactly. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I think that was when we were trying to close in on how widely you were missing. Because I think
Yes.
you sent me the video and you were like all over the place.
All over the place, because it
Now,
was not live ABs to a 9 pocket, and it was just
yeah,
all over.
yeah. So that's when we like, okay, we got to kind of make command part of this equation. We have to be purposeful, and we can't be completely random because you have a clear um short, like not weakness, I don't want to say, but like clear area to be worked on, which one
Mhm.
of the things was command. Now we have to keep that the most challenging part of things, and still accept variability, encourage variability. So we shifted the focus from just having variability from variability's sake to accepting variability, but still working on command. And I got a lot of ideas about that from like basketball coaches who are implementing some of this. Like Alex Sarama is a great example of like how they use differential learning without losing the goal of like actually making shots, right? You can't just like have random stuff and be missing way out there. There's still intention around like hitting a certain spot on the rim. And again, accomplishing that task goal with variability type of approach, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
No, that makes total sense because just hearing that example, like there's too much variability, and then there's enough to where you're kind of making them uncomfortable. But like Tanner said, you have to have it to where there's at least enough success that it's not super demoralizing for a guy, right? But I think a practical example for that too, for any of the listeners, like maybe you have a guy or maybe you yourself, you're throwing in the bullpen and you're doing the same sequence pre-game every single time. And I knew I had that. I was like, hey, 5 fastballs, 2 curveballs, 2 changeups. All right, cool. Let's do a simulated batter and then we're ready to rock into the game. But if you never mix that up and all of a sudden, your first couple pitches is like, hey, slider, 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 what are the odds of all those going to be landed for strikes? Probably not very many, right?
Yeah. Like pregame routine is like a difficult conversation because like you have to balance out, all right, how much confidence do we need going in and feel good going in, um and versus like, okay, what's actually going to prepare you for the game. And that's like a thing that you have to navigate where like it, you can like make it representative, but if your confidence is shot, that still plays an effect to the game, right? So that's kind of a short time frame where you might be prioritizing certain things over the other depending on that person as well. So it's really difficult to talk about things in general, but you're right. Like, okay, are there opportunities to make things not so rigid? Like, are there opportunities to add a little bit more variability, add a little bit more representativeness in your own environment without losing sight of the big goal? In some cases, that's pain. Some cases, that's command. Some cases, that's velocity and tissue adaptation. All these things. So it's just like we talked about this on the first podcast too, but it's like the path isn't so narrow. There's a lot more room to kind of sidestep while still going to that North Star.
No, I totally agree. And I think that that also kind of alluded to a little bit of more of like you were saying at the very beginning, it's that psychological piece that you have to respect that a lot of guys may, it's like, hey, here's the program, and we're gonna stick to this program and do these exact reps at these exact amount of days per week. But when you're interacting with a guy, uh, sometimes those plans change. And you have to learn how to ebb and flow with that as ecological as it can be.
Live stuff. We did a lot with that too. Because you had limited opportunities to go live, we tried to make the best of each session. So we kind of went in with different intentions. I know we're kind of getting up on time, but maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess where are you what are you thinking with this? Like where do you want to go to first? Because I'm trying to think back of what were some of like the first things that we tried.
Um, let's see. Initially, so we were kind of having difficulty just getting new live sessions. So some of the first ones, obviously, you were just like, all right, I actually got a hitter tomorrow, so we're just going to kind of get it done.
Mhm.
But as we found out more and more of areas to be worked on, again, we tried to kind of like design games within a game to try to like get you to explore those solution space kind of from highly representative perspective. So I think we did like certain sessions where you had to get outs with certain pitches or you had to
Yes.
throw first pitch something, putting some of those constraints to explore. More recently, we were talking about like how can we get you to get a feel for the hitter earlier? Like how can we shape intention on the first AB, like the first round through the lineup, to get a better feel for that hitter,
Mhm.
instead of like, all right, first round through the lineup, I'm just gonna pitch to get outs. But can we add intentions about like, okay, I'm a starter, I'm gonna see this many rounds. How can I get these guys out, but still like learn about them, like perceive things about them that is going to serve me in the second round of the through the lineup, right?
Mhm.
So those are some intentions that we've kind of worked through. Obviously, you know we were tinkering around, we're just kind of playing around with different intentions. But does that do you remember some of those things?
Yeah, I think one of the first ones we did was like I was trying to work on a changeup. Like that is a pitch I have never been able to throw effectively in my entire life. And it was just like, okay, I finally found a grip that felt comfortable and that would reach the plate. And I think, the first AB, I couldn't throw any other pitch except for a changeup until I got it for a strike or for a swing or something like that. Then I could do whatever I wanted.
Oh, cool. It's kind of like
And
a
then,
way through the pitches, right?
yeah. And then the next AB was I had to try and get an out with a changeup. And then the third AB was do whatever you want, like different things like that. Or um, there was one where it's like, okay, there's five ABs and we're going to keep track of points. Like if you get a changeup for first pitch strike, you got X amount of points. If you got a swing and miss in general, you got X amount of points. If you got a strikeout, points. If you got a strikeout with I think a fastball, I think was one of the sessions. Like if you got to strike out with a fastball, that got you the most points just because I don't have a very fast fastball. So it was like, if I can learn how to set that up to make it look fast, great. So we did some things like that.
Game within the game.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah, I can't remember what
Yeah.
else we've done or what we did
I
early
think
on.
this was an area where like we were really co-creating, because it's not like I work with like performance level baseball pitchers all the time, and you do, you're a baseball coach, you're a pitching coach. So we were actually discussing a lot more instead of like me giving you constraints to try. So we were like kind of discussing about ideas of what to do, kind of getting your insight into it, just me acting as almost like a sounding board,
Mm-hmm.
as much as like an idea generator, I guess. So we had a lot of discussion going on there. And by no means we were like the best CLA application for a pitching. Like, like we were just trying to kind of navigate it and try to like try out different things, to make it better. So I'm actually kind of curious to talk or hear more about like what other pitching coaches are
Yeah.
doing, right? Like we were always kind of talking about like, have you talked to other people who are into ecological dynamics and how they like to coach live sessions, right? Because I was like, okay, I'm still kind of navigating this. I'm still learning about this. So we had a lot of like good discussions on that.
Yeah. And I think to kind of touch on that last part, it's like, yes, I think there are coaches that say that they're into ecological dynamics when it comes to pitching, but then like they're trying, but also at the same time, they keep reverting back to a perfect set of mechanics for everybody, and so it's like they may have an understanding of like, yes, there needs to be context, but then there's also like pulling from the other side of the fence saying you need to have perfect mechanics in context. And so I think for me too, like I'm still navigating through that because there really isn't anybody at the forefront with pitching saying, here we go. I think there are a couple guys that are trying, but it just doesn't make even logical sense with some of the things that they're doing. And it's no knock on them, but I think it just is a misunderstanding of the underpinning theory of all of it. And so I think, like you said, what we were doing probably wasn't the best way, but it was a very productive and very functional way because it wasn't like, oh, let's just do this over and over and over again. Like it kind of changed session to session. Like there was one where you were just like, hey, today, see if you can get the batter's feet to move. And then now that's like my favorite thing to do because then it sets up so many other options for me. Like, because there was a time where, and I still struggle with it, but trying to get the fastball to go arm side. I always pull it glove side and I just paint that inside corner, but I can't just live there with that pitch. And I was really trying to force going arm side. And he goes, well, if you miss glove side, what other opportunities are there? And so looking at it through that lens, like, okay, yeah, I threw an 0-0 back foot slider and I didn't mean to throw it there, but I got his feet to move. What else does that open up? Well, that could open up a fastball glove side to a righty because they just saw that last pitch go right at them. So they're going to freeze or they're going to flinch back. They're going to step back and take that. Now we're 1-1. And I know that inside of the plate is kind of open for me now. I could go there again, or I could go something soft away, which I'm really good at. So then getting their feet to move opens up the whole plate for me. So we started looking at it as like, what other options are available even when you miss? And I think it just goes like to the old school pitching. Like,
Yeah.
if you miss, like, okay, what does that set up? Like grew up listening to Giants games my whole life, and one of their play-by-play guy, I'm forgetting his name, Kruko. And he was just like, yeah, if you miss like that's going to set you up for another pitch. Like he talked about that all the time. Like if you miss up, you can go back down in the zone, change eye level. If you miss inside, you can probably go back to that inside pitch or maybe go soft away. Like, again, an old school approach because he pitched in, I think, the 80s, but it still holds true because of the underpinning ideas behind it. Like what other opportunities are out there? And I think that was also very valuable because now it's like if I go 1-0, I'm not worried about me falling behind. I'm actually like, oh, sweet, where that missed opens up this part of the zone for me. Let's exploit that.
Yeah, that was probably one of our a better application of like this ecological or dynamics approach of like what happens prior to what's happening now can set up affordances, right? So that was one way, one of the better ways we've implemented the concept of affordances um, and um, perceiving to act and acting to perceive some of these things into your live sessions.
Yeah, and I think those were again like the most valuable ones was we're like navigating through that together rather than there being a dictator and a slave almost is kind of what it ends up being. So I just do exactly whatever you say. It was more of a conversation of just like, okay, let's try this. Give me your feedback. Okay, maybe that wasn't the greatest, or oh, okay, that was good. How can we make it better? And it became, like you said, co-creating rather than master and slave or dictator, whatever you want to call it. But
Oh, for sure. Well, and then just watching like some of the college playoffs recently, I mean, they are kind of doing that, and some of them do have the ability to shake it off. Like they have the pitch com system, they're like, this is what I do. Okay, cool. Now I get to throw it. Versus, maybe you have a guy who is seeing and having the attention of, oh, hey, yeah, this guy did back out of the box after I just came in with a fastball inside. Um, Maybe giving them a little bit more freedom. Like it's like, hey, here's a suggestion. And I'm sure there's coaches out there that are like, hey, this is my suggestion of what you should pitch. Because I know there's some of them, even at the higher levels, they're just like, hey, we're going to let our catcher and our pitcher call the game because they have a really good thing. But then maybe some of them may not have those reins, lifted, so to speak, yet. Because they're just like, hey, if we put this guy in, he's going to go fastball, fastball, fastball on every guy. So it's, I think having that approach where you can guide them to get off of that pitch com system, as it being like training wheels versus it being, hey, we're always going to have this and we're going to lean on this really, really heavily. Because it takes away some of the art of what they can do and how they're able to pitch and notice intentions. And some of the games I watched too were um like the entire lineup had the exact same approach. I'm like, that's the easiest lineup to throw to, right? For I guess versus a Sunday League guy, like there's some guys like, hey, I'm dead pulled no matter what. But if all of them have the same exact swing, or maybe not the exact same swing path, but like the same approach to certain counts or certain pitches, then it's like, hey, I'm basically facing the same guy almost every at bat, and that almost becomes boring to a pitcher. It's like, all right, hey, here we go. Easy to dice you up because I know what you're trying to do.
yeah, it's to kind of go back to the whole pitch comp system. It's like, if you look at the highest level, if you look at MLB, more often than not, it's a pitcher and catcher calling a game. And so it's like, I hear coaches, college, high school, are like, well, they're not pros yet, that I need to call the game. And it's like, well, are you holding somebody back because you're not teaching them or allowing them to call their own game? And it's like, I don't know, it really, really irks me when pitching or like college coaches are calling every single pitch and say, hey, you can't shake off. There are a lot of good ones that will like leave it open to be shaken off. But I think at the end of the day, if your guys don't know how to call, that's on you as a coach for not teaching them or not walking through, hey, this is your arsenal. Like what is the pitch that you feel the most conviction behind, and what is your pitch that you absolutely hate throwing because you don't have as much confidence? Okay, this is how we can make it work and still throw your least favorite pitch just to show that you have it. And I think that's where it falls short, is because they don't have that co-creation. It is,
Mhm.
you're going to do what I say and that's it. And then it bleeds into, you know, a pitching coach taking a whole staff and saying everybody is going to throw this type of fastball. Everybody's going to be a sinker ball guy because I was when I played. Like that is the dumbest thing I think you could do. Is I'm going to be honest, like it really is. Like when you constrain to force anything, you're just ruining it for the athlete. Like if they have a really good four seam fastball, why would you take that away if that's one of their best weapons? Like, and just again, that co-creative piece I think is just so valuable, because as soon as you become a dictator in one, you become a dictator in every other coaching aspect that you do. And I did it when I started because I thought I had all the answers, and then I met Rich White and Tyler Yerby and quickly found out I knew absolutely nothing, and I still feel that way sometimes. But I think that's part of being a coach that's willing to co-create, is you understand that you don't have all the answers for your athletes because you are not that athlete. You don't know what's going on. And as soon as you can start to understand what's going on, or begin to, even at a surface level, then it can give you better insight as to how they can find their answers, instead of here's the answer, this is it.
Absolutely.
I know I kind of went off topic a little bit, but
no, I love it. I think it's kind of almost a good example of, hey, like we're co-creating this podcast too. Right? Like we're still kind of bouncing off each other. It's not because that's just not who I am, even as a coach, or even how I do podcasts. It's not super scripted. I might have certain bullet points that I want to touch on, right? But if I did that, it would be way too scripted, and people don't want to listen to that, right? Like they like the co-creative, the more flowing into more of an actual conversation type of content, right? So awesome. Well, you guys have anything else, or any other things off the top of your head that you wanted to touch on?
Not necessarily. I mean, we covered a lot. We kind of
yeah.
almost went
Oh,
through
great.
this whole journey of like, when there is pain, what are the opportunities? When there is less pain, what opportunities arise? And at the performance level, how are we incorporating ecological dynamics ideas and principles into practice? And you're somebody, Tanner, you're somebody who like like I mean, we've been working together for quite a while, and I've definitely appreciated how like you've helped me grow as a coach as well, in terms of just like discussing some of these ideas, and again just navigating pain situations, performance situations. And especially because I had stepped away from the world of baseball for a few years, while I was in um, grad school and stuff. So it's been kind of fun to like have you almost lead me back out to the baseball world,
Mhm.
and to kind of just like think about, all right, like how can I apply things that I've been learning back to my original passion of like baseball and performance, and just enjoying the game, I guess.
Mhm.
I love it. I love it, guys. I appreciate it. You guys were awesome. Tanner, did you have any closing remarks before we end it?
No, I don't think so, other than like, the journey that I've been through with Yuji. I've enjoyed it. It's been fun because it's been so different execution wise, but it's also something where it's like I'm going to continue to pay for his service because of how valuable I really do think it is. And I don't know if people quite understand like how valuable having somebody that is willing to say, I don't really know, but this is where we can start.
Mhm.
And then, like kind of not focusing on just one root cause when really like there's a whole forest out there. Let's go explore it. So, having somebody that can actually say, I don't know for a fact, here's a starting point. And really our finishing point is to back to pitching or being healthy. But there's so many different ways to get there, instead of it being like, hey, here's a progression. You're going to pay me over $1,000. Here you go. You follow this to a T. You should be fine. If it doesn't work, then you're the problem. There was no conversation that like said I was broken or I was the problem. It was like, hey, let's just figure out how to solve the problem. Like there's nothing wrong with me as an athlete, not broken, don't need to be fixed. It was just like, let's get you pain free. And I think a lot of people are willing to say, like, hey, you're broken. Here's the answer. I have the answer. I have the only answer. And here you go. And I think people are like finding more value in that rather than somebody who's willing to say, I might be wrong at first, but we're definitely going to figure out how to get you to where you want to be.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's super valuable. And, if anything, I think the resounding theme of this is like, hey, don't be a dictator, be a co-creator. So I love it. Awesome. Well, appreciate you guys again for taking the time. And for those of you listening, stay in the zone.